Really scary stories, every day. Subscribe, like if you like, turn on the bell so you don't miss new videos. I needed the work. My savings account had precisely $43 and some change, and rent was due in 5 days. When the Craigslist ad said quietly, over and overnight maintenance, Ravenbridge Fairgrounds, $22 an hour, I didn't ask too many questions. The park sat about 15 miles outside town down a 2-lane road that wound through thick tree line. I'd driven past it a few times during the day. One of those small family operations that did decent business in summer, but glanced pretty dead this time of year. Late season nights in Missouri got raw fast, and most people weren't thinking about carnival rides when frost was forming on their windshields. My compact sedan's headlights swept across the entrance as I pulled into the grit lot. The main access gate was chained shut, but there was a smaller staffer entrance to the left with a hand-painted sign that said quietly "Staff Only." The whole place glanced different at. During the day, even shut, it had that cheerful abandoned feeling of a carnival between seasons. I parked near the entrance and checked my watch. Walter Schmidt, the guy who'd hired me over the phone, had said quietly to meet him at the main operations office at 8 sharp. His had been gruff, no nonsense, like he'd been doing this shift since before I was born. I pushed through and found myself on a narrow service lane that led between game booths and food stands. Everything was shut down tight. Tarps covering the funnel cake stand. The service lane was lit by a few scattered sentry that cast long shadows between the attractions. The main operations office turned out to be a small building near the center of the park, tucked between the Tilta and something called the Twister. It was one of those prefab structures that glanced like it had been dropped there in the 80s and never updated. Fake wood paneling, narrow panes, a door that had been painted so many times you could see the layers peeling at the edges. Walter Schmidt was waiting for me on the front steps. He glanced precisely like he'd sounded on the phone, stocky build, 5 feet 7 inches, with graying brown hair and the weathered face you get from working outdoors for decades. He wore a faded park supervisor jacket and had a ring of keys hanging from his belt that glanced like it could unlock half the county. It wasn't a question. Alexander Harrison, actually Morrison's my middle name. I'd used it on the application because my real name was tied to some credit issues I didn't want to explain. Walter's eyes didn't quite meet mine. Right. Sure thing. What precisely will I be doing? Maintenance, checking the perimeter, securing equipment, basic maintenance. The operations office was small and cramped with a metal workbench, a couple of steel cabinet, and an old coffee maker that glanced older than me. The walls were covered with park site maps, maintenance schedules, and safety notices. A pane faced out toward the merry-go-round, which sat dark and still about 50 yards away. Walter made my way to the workbench and picked up a laminated sheet of paper. Before we go over your duties, you need to read this. He handed me the sheet. At the top, in bold letters, it said quietly, "Over and overnight shift instructions follow precisely." Below that were 5 numbered items. 1. Do not enter the tree line surrounding the park between 1 a.m. Stay within the park boundaries at all times during these hours. Its painted horses seemed to angle their glassy eyes toward the operations office. Remain in the operations office and do not glance directly at the ride during this time. 3. If a man knocks on the operations office pane at 3 a.m., do not acknowledge him. Do not open the pane or door. Continue your work and ignore him completely. At 400 a.m. Close all operations office blinds and do not glance outside until 4:30 a.m. If you see moving in the tree line, do not investigate. If a child enters the operations office claiming to be lost, immediately call emergency services. Do not let the child leave until police arrive. Is this some kind of joke? His expression didn't change. These instructions are. I searched for the right word. What's this about someone on the pane at 3 a.m.? Walter took the sheet back and placed it on the workbench. The instructions keep you safe. Safe from what? For making the same mistakes other employees made. He made my way to the steel cabinet and pulled out a board. We've had some incidents over the years. People who didn't follow the instructions. What incidents? Walter's jaw tightened. The kind where we had to hire new employees. The way he said quietly, it made my stomach drop. Are you saying people died? I'm saying people who follow the instructions go home in the morning. Well, we don't have that problem anymore because now we have instructions. I fixed my gaze at the laminated sheet. The instructions were typed in a simple font, nothing fancy, but something about seeing them laid out so matter-of-factly made them feel more real, more serious. Glance, I said quietly, I need this shift, but I also need to understand what I'm getting into. Walter was already heading for the door. Your shift starts at 8 o'clock. I'll be back at 6 a.m. The maintenance checklist is on the workbench along with keys to the equipment sheds. Radio sets there if you need to call for help, but cell service is spotty out here. Walter, wait. The instructions aren't suggestions, Morrison. They're not guidelines. Now he did turn and his brown eyes finally met mine. You follow them precisely or you find another shift. Those are your options. The door shut behind him with a soft click, leaving me alone in the operations office. Each one seemed more insane than the last. Okay, that could be a safety thing. Wild animals, or unstable ground, but don't glance at the merry-go-round between 2 and 2:15. Ignore someone on the pane at precisely 3 a.m. Close the blinds at 4 o'clock and don't glance at in the tree line. It sounded like something out of a horror movie, the shift where the new guy gets killed in the first act because he doesn't take the warning seriously. But Walter's tone hadn't been that of someone playing a prank or trying to scare the new staffer. He'd sounded like a man who'd seen things he didn't want to talk about, like someone who'd learned these instructions the hard way. I took a seat at the workbench and glanced out the pane toward the merry-go-round. It was a classic carousel. 40 its painted horses seemed to angle their glassy eyes toward the operations office. FT across with painted horses frozen in mid-gallop. During the day, it glanced its painted horses seemed to angle their glassy eyes toward the operations office. Cheerful and inviting. Right now, with the sentry casting shadows between the painted horses, it glanced like something from a nightmare. Its painted horses seemed to angle their glassy eyes toward the operations office. Walter was gone, driving back to town, leaving me alone with a list of instructions that made no sense and a growing feeling that I made a terrible mistake. But I needed the money. $43 wouldn't cover rent, and jobs that paid $22 an hour didn't grow on dark pines in rural Missouri. Follow the instructions, do the maintenance work, collect my paycheck. I folded the instructions sheet and put it in my shirt pocket, then picked up the maintenance checklist. Check the perimeter boundary fence. Secure any loose equipment. Clean the concrete lanes. Normal work for a normal shift, except for the 5 instructions that suggested this was anything but normal. I rose and grabbed the keys from the workbench. The sooner I began on the maintenance work, the sooner the would be over. And, if I was lucky, nothing would happen that would make me understand why those instructions existed in the first place. The pane facing the merry-go-round, its painted horses seemed to angle their glassy eyes toward the operations office. Seemed bigger, more prominent, like it was watching me as much as I was watching it. I pulled the maintenance checklist closer and tried to focus on the work ahead. Outside, the late-season harsh wind picked up, rattling the operations office panes and making the sentry sway on their poles. The shadows between the carnival rides shifted and moved, creating the illusion of movement where there shouldn't be any. I checked my watch again. 8:20 p.m. 9 hours and 40 minutes to follow 5 simple instructions and pretend this was another maintenance shift. I grabbed the maintenance checklist from the workbench and headed outside. The cool late-season air hitting my face as I stepped into the park. The sentry cast long shadows between the rides, making everything glance different than it had during my brief walk to the operations office. I pulled out my phone to check the time, 8:20 p.m. Plenty of time to get through the basic tasks before things got weird. The perimeter boundary fence was my first stop. I made my way the outer edge of the park, checking for loose posts or damaged sections. The chain link stretched about 8 feet high, topped with 3 strands of barbed wire that glanced newer than the rest of the fencing. Every 50 yards or so, I found metal signs bolted to the posts. No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. Most of the boundary fence glanced solid, but I found a section near the back where a tree had fallen during some storm and bent the top rail. The chain link sagged, but hadn't torn. I made a note on the checklist and kept moving. The tree line pressed close to the boundary fence line here, thick enough that I couldn't see more than 20 feet into the dark pines. Something about the darkness between those trunks made me walk a little faster. The tool shed sat behind the tilt whirl, a metal building about the size of a 2-car garage. Walter's keys worked on the first try, and I flipped the light switch to reveal shelves lined with tools, cleaning supplies, and spare parts for the rides. Everything glanced organized. Wrenches hung on peg boards. Coils of electrical wire sorted by gauge. I grabbed a push broom and a bucket of cleaning solution, then locked the shed back up. Leaves had blown in from the surrounding dark pines, collecting in corners and around the base of the rides. I swept the main paths first, the wide concrete strips that connected the entrance to the center of the park. The broom scraped against the pavement, the sound echoing off the silent rides. Every few minutes, I'd stop and listen, but all I caught was harsh wind moving through the dark pines and the distant hum of the sentry. The twister had loose safety chains hanging from 2 of the cars. I climbed up on the platform and secured them to their proper positions, checking that the latches worked smoothly. The metal was raw under my hands. I tested each vehicle's restraint system, making sure nothing would come loose if the ride was running. The tilt-a-whirl needed similar attention. Candy wrappers, a plastic cup, some napkins that had been there since the park shut for the season. I cleaned them out and checked the safety belts. By 10:30, I'd worked my way through most of the basic maintenance tasks. The park felt different now that I'd been walking around it for over 2 hours. Less threatening, more like what it actually was, a collection of aging carnival rides and game booths that needed constant maintenance. I was starting to think the instructions were Walter's way of messing with new employees. I headed back to the operations office and made myself a cup of coffee with the ancient machine on the steel cabinet. The coffee tasted like it had been sitting in the pot since the Carter administration, but it was hot and had caffeine. I settled into the workbench seat and worked on some sheets. Inventory sheets for cleaning supplies, a maintenance log that needed updating, a stack of safety inspection sheets. I found myself checking it more often as the wore on, thinking about those instructions folded in my shirt pocket. At 11:45, I pulled them out and read through them again. Stay out of the tree line between 1 and 5 a.m., tree line at could be dangerous. Uneven ground, low branches, wild animals. At 12:50, I put down my pen and kept watch the clock. 4 minutes 3. I could feel my heart beating a little faster, which was stupid. Nothing was going to happen. The minute hand clicked to 12:01 a.m., something crashed through the dark pines beyond the boundary fence. The sound came from deep in the tree line, 100 yards out. Heavy, like a large animal moving fast through underbrush, branches snapping, leaves rustling, then hush. Nothing for 30 seconds. Whatever was out there was big, bigger than a deer or even a bear. The sounds moved parallel to the boundary fence line, heading toward the back of the park. My hands were shaking slightly as I lifted my pen and tried to focus on the sheets. Had to be a fallen tree that was still settling. The tree line were full of normal explanations for strange sounds. Another crash. Something was definitely moving out there and it was following the perimeter of the park. I kept my pen moving, filling out a supply order form that didn't need to be done until morning. The sounds continued for the next 20 minutes. always beyond the boundary fence in those dark pines. I kept my eyes on the sheets and tried to ignore the way my shoulders tensed every time something crashed through the underbrush. At 1:20, the sound went still completely. The hush felt heavier than the noise had been. I waited another 10 minutes before I allowed myself to relax. By 1:45, I was thinking about the second instructions. Its painted horses seemed to angle their glassy eyes toward the operations office. Don't glance directly at it. I could see the ride through the operations office pane, a classic carousel with painted horses and mirrors that reflected the century. It glanced plain and ordinary, another piece of carnival equipment sitting silent in the dark. I positioned myself at the workbench where I could see the merry-go-round clearly, but still work on sheets. The clock showed 1:58, 1:59, 200 a.m. The merry-go-rounds came on, not the sentry that had been illuminating it all. These were the ride zone, colored bulbs strung around the canopy, mirrors that caught and reflected the sheen, painted details on the painted horses that suddenly stood out in bright relief. Then it began to turn slowly at first, a gentle rotation that made the painted horses rise and fall on their polished metal poles. The calliope music wasn't playing, but I could almost hear it anyway. That tiny mechanical melody that all carousels seem to use. The painted horses moved up and down, around and around, their glass eyes catching the light. I caught the movement. Its painted horses seemed to angle their glassy eyes toward the operations office. In my peripheral vision and almost glanced directly at the ride before I remembered the instructions. Don't glance directly at it. I forced my eyes back to the sheets, but I could still see the standing shape in the edge of my vision. Tall, wearing dark clothes, standing precisely still while the merry-go-round turned around it. The mirrors flashed, but the standing shape never moved. I gripped the pen tighter and tried to focus on the supply order, but the words kept blurring together. The merry-go-round kept turning, that slow, hypnotic rotation that seemed to pull at the corner of my eye. Part of me needed to see what was standing out there among the painted horses. I didn't glance. 205,208,212. The merry-go-round. Its painted horses seemed to angle their glassy eyes toward the operations office. Kept turning, and the standing shape kept standing there motionless in the center of all that movement. I filled out 3 more sheets and tried to ignore the way my skin felt like it was crawling. Its painted horses seemed to angle their glassy eyes toward the operations office. They went out all at once, plunging the ride back into the dim sheen of the yard lighting. I waited another full minute before I allowed myself to glance directly at it. The merry-go-round sat silent and empty, its painted horses seemed to angle their glassy eyes toward the operations office. Painted horses on polished metal poles. No standing shape, no movement, another piece of carnival equipment that hadn't run in months. I set down my pen and flexed my fingers, realizing I'd been gripping it hard enough to leave marks on my palm. 2 instructions down, 3 to go. And I was starting to understand that Walter hadn't been messing with me at all. I glanced at my watch. 2:48 a.m. I'd made it through the merry-go-round incident without glancing directly at whatever that standing shape was. And now I had to prepare for instructions. Its painted horses seemed to angle their glassy eyes toward the operations office. 3. I got up from the workbench and made my way to each pane in the operations office. There were 4 of them, one facing the merry-go-round, one on each side wall, and one behind the workbench that glanced toward the tool shed. I pulled the curtains shut on 3 of them, leaving a small gap in the one facing the merry-go-round so I could still see outside if I needed to. My hands were steadier now than they'd been. Its painted horses seemed to angle their glassy eyes toward the operations office. During the merry-go-round thing. Either way, I felt more in control as I settled back at the workbench with my sheets. I lifted my pen and focused on the supply order form in front of me. Cleaning solution, trash bags, replacement safety equipment, normal stuff. I wrote down quantities and part numbers, keeping my eyes on the paper. They began at precisely 3. 3 sharp raps on the pane behind me. The one that faced the tool shed. I kept writing, filling in the form like nothing was happening. Rap. Rap. More insistent this time. I could hear it clearly, but I forced myself to keep working. The pen felt slippery in my hand, but I managed to write down industrial floor cleaner 2 gall in neat handwriting. Hey, you in there? I didn't respond. Instructions 3 was specific. I turned the page on my board and began filling out a maintenance request form for the frayed safety belt I'd found on the tiltaw. I can see you in there. Open up. Safety belt replacement needed, and checked the box for priority repair. My handwriting was getting a little shaky, but it was still legible. The changed tactics. Glance, I work here, too. I'm maintenance staff. That made me pause for a second. The sounded ordinary, reasonable, like a guy who did work here and was having a problem. Follow the instructions precisely. I kept on writing. Safety belt frayed. Needs immediate replacement. Come on, man. I'm wearing the uniform and everything. I can see you sitting right there. Why won't you help me? Equipment inventory. Push brooms, cleaning solutions, safety equipment, spare parts. For about 30 seconds, there was complete hush. Then it began again, but different, rhythmic, like someone was trying to break the glass. Bang. Bang. I gripped my pen tighter and kept writing. The sound was getting louder, more violent, like whoever was out there was hitting the pane with something heavy. Let me in. Let me in. The was getting higher, more frantic, less human somehow. But I didn't turn around. I kept filling out sheets like it was the most important thing in the world. The banging continued for what felt like forever, but was only a few minutes. I could hear it traveling around the building. At each pane, the same pattern. At the front pane, they tried a different approach. I know you're following those stupid instructions, but I'm not what you think I am. I began a new form, safety inspection checklist. I went through each ride systematically, noting what I'd checked and what needed attention. Those instructions aren't protecting you. They're protecting something else. Something that doesn't want you to know the truth. That was right outside the front pane now, 3 feet from where I sat. I could hear breathing through the glass. If you glance at me, you'll see I'm telling the truth. I have the same keys Walter gave you. That got my attention, but I kept my pen moving. How could he know about Walter? I've been trying to warn people for months. Every someone new comes to work here and every they follow those instructions like sheep. But the instructions aren't keeping you safe. I finished the safety checklist and moved on to a supply request form. Glance at me once. See for yourself. It sounded so genuine, so desperate, like someone who was trying to help. But Walter's words kept echoing. Follow the instructions precisely. They're the difference between going home to your family and becoming another incident report. I glanced at my watch. Almost over. The went hushed. Then I caught steps. But this time, they didn't stop at the panes. They kept circling around and around the operations office like someone pacing. The steps went still. I sat there for another minute, pen poised over the paper, waiting, but nothing happened. Whatever had been out there was gone. My shirt was soaked with sweat, and my hands were cramping from gripping the pen. So tight. I'd followed instructions 3 precisely. I hadn't acknowledged the man. Hadn't even glanced in his direction. I glanced at my watch again. 38 minutes until the next instructions kicked in. I spent the next half hour organizing the sheets I'd completed and reviewing the maintenance checklist. Everything was in order. The inventory was accurate and all the safety issues were documented. At 3:55 a.m. I began preparing for instructions 4. Don't glance outside until 4:30 a.m. I made my way to each pane and checked the curtains. The fourth, the one with the small gap I'd left open, I'd need to close completely in 5 minutes. I stood by the merry-go-round pane, my hand on the curtain. Through its painted horses seemed to angle their glassy eyes toward the operations office. The gap, I could see the sentry casting their usual harsh sheen over the empty rides. Everything glanced normal. 4 a.m. I pulled the curtain shut, eliminating the last bit of outside visibility. And that's when I saw the first light. It was a faint sheen seeping through a tiny gap where the curtain didn't quite meet the pane frame. Soft, pulsing light that definitely wasn't from the security system. I forced myself to step away from the pane and sit back down at the workbench. Don't investigate in the tree line. The instructions was clear. I could see it even with the curtains shut. A gentle blue-white sheen that seemed to pulse with a rhythm like a heartbeat. I could tell because the sheen was coming from multiple directions now, not the tree line, but from different areas around the park. They pulsed in sequence like some pattern or signal. I lifted my pen and tried to focus on the sheets, but it was impossible to ignore what was happening outside. I could see their sheen shifting position, traveling through the park in slow, deliberate patterns. The blue-white sheen was getting stronger, seeping through gaps in all the curtains now. It pulsed faster as it approached, and I could hear something else, a low hum sound, almost musical. The light went still right outside the front pane. It wasn't one tone anymore, but multiple harmonies weaving together in patterns that seemed almost familiar, like a song I'd caught before, but couldn't quite remember. I gripped my pen and fixed my gaze at the sheets, but the music was hypnotic. It made me want to glance, to see what was creating such unreasonably beautiful sounds. I caught myself and pulled my hand back. Don't glance outside. The light pulsed brighter and the music got more insistent. I could see their sheen through curtains on the other panes. They surrounded the operations office, each one low hum its own harmony, creating a symphony that made my chest ache with longing. It was the most unreasonably beautiful thing I'd ever caught, and I couldn't glance at it. The light stayed for what felt like hours, but was only 20 minutes. They pulsed and sang and moved in patterns around the operations office, sometimes coming close enough that the walls themselves seemed to sheen. The music rose and fell in waves, sometimes soft and gentle, sometimes building to crescendos that made the panes vibrate. Then gradually they began to retreat. The music faded, the dimmed, and one by one, they moved away from the operations office and back toward the tree line. The last one lingered for a moment outside the front pane, its sheen barely visible through the curtain before finally disappearing into the darkness. I glanced at my watch and confirmed the time. According to instructions 4, I could glance outside now, but I didn't. I sat there for another few minutes, listening to the hush and trying to process what had happened. When I finally pulled open the curtains, everything glanced normal. The sentry cast their usual harsh sheen over empty rides and concrete lanes. There was no sign that anything unusual had occurred, but I could still hear echoes of that music in my head, and I knew I'd never forget the beauty of those. At 5:30 a.m. I was slumped over the workbench, my head resting on my arms. The in-the-tree line had been gone for an hour, and I figured I had 30 minutes before Walter showed up to end this nightmare shift. My eyes burned from staying awake and every muscle in my body ached from the constant tension. Soft, light steps on the grid outside. Not the heavy boots Walter wore, and definitely not the deliberate pacing from earlier. I lifted my head and checked my watch. The steps went still right outside the front door. I sat up straighter, my heart starting to pound again, when I thought I was done with scares for the door handle turned slowly and the door swung open without a rap, without any warning at all. He glanced about 8 years old, 9. Brown hair that needed a comb, wearing a red t-shirt and blue jeans that glanced normal enough, not torn or dirty like you'd expect from someone who'd been lost in the tree line all. His sneakers were white with grass stains on the sides. He had that pale, tired glance kids get when they've been crying, but his eyes were dry now. "Excuse me," he said quietly, his small and polite. "Can you help me find my parents?" Every alarm bell in my head went off at once. If a child enters claiming to be lost, immediately call emergency services. Don't let the child leave until police arrive. I reached for the phone on the workbench, keeping my eyes on the kid. "Sure, I can help you. What's your name?" "Jamie," he said quietly, taking a step closer to the workbench. "My mom and dad brought me to the park yesterday, but I got separated from them. The park had been shut for hours before my shift even began. Not unless something wrong was happening." "Okay, Jamie, I'm going to call some people who can help find your parents." "All right." But the kid's whole demeanor changed instantly. "No," he said quietly, his sharp and much louder. "Don't call anyone." I kept dialing. "It's okay, Jamie. They'll help us locate your mom and dad." The kid's cracked and he moved toward the workbench with his hands clenched into fists. "You don't understand." The emergency operator picked up. "What's your emergency?" "This is Alexander Harrison at Ravenbridge Fairgrounds," I said quietly, watching Jamie's face go white. "I have a lost child here who needs assistance." Jamie began pacing back and forth in front of the workbench, his movements jerky and agitated. "You shouldn't have done that," he kept saying. "You shouldn't have called them. They're going to take me away." "Can you describe the child?" the operator asked low. "Male, approximately 8 years old, brown hair, wearing a red shirt and blue jeans, says his name is Jamie Patterson." The kid went still pacing and fixed my gaze at me with an expression I couldn't read. Not angry anymore, but something else. Something that made my skin crawl. The operator said quietly, "Keep the child calm and don't let them leave the premises." "Understood." I hung up and glanced at Jamie, who had moved to the pane facing the merry-go-round. He was examining the curtains I'd shut earlier, running his small fingers along the edges like he was testing how well they were sealed. "The police will be here soon and they'll help us find your parents." He didn't answer. Instead, he made my way to the side pane and did the same thing, checking the curtains, testing the fabric. Then he moved to the back pane, the one where the had come from during instructions 3. "These are shut tight," he said quietly, his oddly flat. "Why did you close all the panes?" "Keeping the operations office secure," I said quietly, standing up slowly. The kid was making me nervous with his behavior. The way he was examining everything like he was glancing for weak spots. Jamie moved to the front door and tested the handle, pushing it open a few inches before letting it swing shut. "This doesn't lock from the inside," he observed. "The police will need to come in when they get here." He turned to glance at me, and for a second, his face glanced different. The expression in his eyes wasn't what you'd expect from a scared, lost 8-year-old. It was calculating. "How long until they arrive?" he asked low. "Soon. 10 or 15 minutes." Jamie nodded and went back to pacing, but now his movements were more purposeful. He made my way the perimeter of the small operations office, checking each pane again, testing the door handle twice more, even examining the steel cabinet like he was memorizing the layout. "Jamie, are you feeling okay?" "I'm fine," he said quietly without glancing at me. The way he said quietly it made my stomach turn. Kids didn't usually say they were thinking in that tone. It sounded too adult, too deliberate. I stayed standing behind the workbench, keeping the furniture between us. Something about this whole situation felt wrong beyond the obvious weirdness of a kid showing up at 5:30 in the morning. The way he'd reacted to the phone call, the way he was examining the operations office like he was planning something. None of it felt like normal lost child behavior. Jamie went still pacing and stood in the center of the room, glancing directly at me. "You followed all the instructions tonight, didn't you?" "What did you say?" "The instructions? The ones Walter gave you." I didn't answer. "That's why I'm here," Jamie continued, his still in that flat too adult tone. Because you followed them. I don't know what you're talking about. Jamie smiled without warmth, and it wasn't a kid's smile without warmth. If a child enters claiming to be lost, immediately call emergency services. He recited it precisely, word for word. How do you know that? Because I've been here before, Jamie said quietly, lots of times with other people who worked the shift. Some of them followed the instructions, some of them didn't. What happened to the ones who didn't follow the instructions? They tried to help me find my parents. Before I could ask what that meant, I caught vehicle doors slamming outside. Red and blue flashed through the tiny gaps in the curtains, painting the walls in alternating colors. Please don't let them take me, he said quietly, his small and scared again. I want to find my mom and dad. The front door pulled open and two police entered. I recognized them immediately. Officer Ramirez and Officer Mitchell, the same two who'd responded to calls here before, according to what Walter had implied. They moved with the same practiced efficiency I'd seen in their previous visits, like they'd done this exact thing many times. Alexander Harrison? Yes, that's me. This is Jamie Patterson. Officer Mitchell was already moving toward Jamie with something in his hands. Restraints of some kind, but not regular handcuffs. They glanced more like the specialized equipment you'd use for someone having a medical emergency. Jamie, Officer Ramirez said quietly in a calm, professional. We're here to help you get back where you belong. I don't want to go, Jamie said quietly, backing toward the corner of the operations office. I want to find my parents. I know, Officer Mitchell said quietly, approaching slowly. But you can't stay here. Jamie glanced at me with those two old eyes. Tell them I can stay with you. Tell them you'll help me glance for my mom and dad. I remembered Walter's warning about following the instructions. Precisely. The police know what's best. Disappointment or anger, but he didn't resist when Officer Mitchell reached him. Some soft cuffs that glanced more medical than criminal. Is he okay? I asked low as they led Jamie toward the door. This happens sometimes. Kids get confused, end up places they shouldn't be. Jamie glanced back at me as they reached the door. See you next time, Alexander, he said quietly in that flat adult. They led Jamie outside to their patrol vehicle, and I kept watch through the pane gap as they put him in the back seat. The red and blue were still flashing, casting everything in that eerie, shifting sheen. Officer Ramirez came back to the door. You did the right thing, calling us immediately, he said quietly. Some people try to handle these situations themselves. What precisely was that situation? Keep following whatever protocols your supervisor gave you. They're there for a reason. He left without any further explanation, and I kept watch the patrol vehicle drive away down the grit road. The red and blue disappeared into the distance, leaving me alone in the operations office with the morning light starting to creep through the curtain gaps. 5:58 a.m. Walter would be here soon to end my shift, and I'd survived all 5 instructions. But Jamie's words kept echoing in my head. See you next time, Alexander. Like this wasn't over. Like he'd be back. If child enters claiming to be lost, immediately call emergency services. Don't let child leave until police arrive. The police had come. They'd handled the situation with obvious experience, and they'd removed Jamie from the premises. But the way Jamie had known about the instructions, the way he'd recited instructions 5 word for word, the way the police had been so prepared with specialized restraints, it all suggested this wasn't a random lost child situation. This was something that happened regularly, something the instructions and the police response were specifically designed to handle. I folded the instructions sheet and put it back in my shirt pocket, then began organizing the sheets I'd completed throughout the. In a few minutes, Walter would walk through that door, ask if I'd followed all the instructions, and I'd be able to say yes. I'd survived my first overnight shift at Ravenbridge Fairgrounds. But as I stacked the maintenance sheets and supply requests, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jamie would be back. And next time I'd have to follow instructions 5 again, make the same phone call, watch the same police take him away with the same specialized equipment. The morning light was getting stronger now, filtering through the curtains and making the operations office feel almost normal again, almost like a regular workplace where regular maintenance happened and nothing supernatural or dangerous ever occurred. The instructions weren't suggestions or pranks or elaborate hazing rituals. They were survival instructions tested and refined by previous employees who'd learned the hard way. I caught grit crunching outside and checked my watch. 6 a.m. Walter's truck door slammed and his heavy steps approached the operations office. The grit crunched under tires at precisely 6 a.m. I glanced up from the workbench where I'd been sitting for the past hour, staring at the laminated instructions sheet and trying to process what I lived through. Walter's truck door slammed shut with that heavy sound old pickups make, and his boots began their familiar trudge toward the operations office. He knocked twice before entering, a courtesy he hadn't bothered with yesterday evening. The door swung open and Walter stepped inside, glancing precisely the same as when he'd left me here 10 hours ago. Same faded supervisor jacket, same weathered face, same ring of keys jangling from his belt. But his eyes went straight to the panes, checking that all the curtains were still drawn tight. "Morning," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. I stood up from the workbench seat, my legs stiff from sitting too long. "Morning." Walter's gaze swept the operations office methodically. The shut curtains, the completed sheets stacked neatly on the workbench, the coffee mug I'd been nursing for the past 2 hours. Evidence of whether I'd made it through the intact. "Everything go all right?" But the way he said quietly, it made it clear this wasn't small talk. This was an inspection. I picked up the laminated sheet from the workbench, holding it between us like proof. "I followed all 5 instructions precisely like you said quietly." Walter's eyes fixed on the instructions sheet, then moved back to my face. He was studying me the way you'd examine a vehicle after a long road trip, checking for damage. "Everyone?" I could hear the exhaustion in my own. "Stayed out of the tree line between 1 and 5. Ignored the at 3. Called 911 when the kid showed up." Something shifted in Walter's expression at that last part. Not surprise, more like confirmation of something he'd been expecting. "Jamie Patterson said quietly he was lost. Police Ramirez and Mitchell picked him up around 5:30. Walter nodded slowly like this was all routine information. "Good. You called right away. Didn't try to help him find his parents yourself?" The memory of Jamie's adult saying, "See you next time," made my skin crawl. Followed the instructions precisely. Walter studied my face for another long moment, then seemed to reach some decision. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and he pulled his keys from his belt. No debriefing, no explanation of what I survived, no acknowledgement that there had been anything other than a standard maintenance shift. He moved to the steel cabinet and began pulling out folders like this was any other morning. "Same time tomorrow, 8 p.m. Walter didn't glance up from his sheets. I made my way to the door, then went still with my hand on the handle. "Walter?" "Yeah." He finally glanced up and for a second I saw something in his eyes that might have been sadness or fatigue. "Enough," he said quietly. "Get some sleep, Harrison. You'll need it." The morning air hit me like a slap after 10 hours in that stuffy operations office. The park glanced completely different in daylight, a rundown collection of old rides and peeling paint. The merry-go-round painted horses where its painted horses seemed to angle their glassy eyes toward the operations office. Frozen in their galloping poses, glancing shabby and harmless under the gray late-season sky. I made my way to my compact sedan, fishing the keys out of my pocket. My hands were steadier now than they'd been all, but I could still feel the adrenaline working its way out of my system. The vehicle began on the second try, and I pulled out of the grit lot onto the 2-lane road that led back to town. The drive home gave me 20 minutes to think, and that's when it hit me. This wasn't some elaborate, hazing ritual or psychological test. The instructions weren't Walter's idea of a joke. Everything that had happened, the sounds in the tree line, the standing shape on the merry-go-round, the panes, its painted horses seemed to angle their glassy eyes toward the operations office. The kid who knew things number 8-year-old should know. All of it was real. Each instructions corresponded to something that happened every single. The tree line between 1 and 5 a.m. weren't off limits. They were hunting grounds. It was something that would do worse than kill you if you glanced directly at it. The thing at the panes wasn't trying to get help. The in the tree line weren't unreasonably beautiful. They were bait. He was something else entirely. Something the police had to handle with special restraints. I pulled into the grit lot of my apartment complex and sat there with the engine running, staring at the dashboard. The laminated instructions sheet was still in my shirt pocket, and I could feel it pressing against my chest like a weight. That's what Walter was paying me to survive supernatural encounters that had killed God knows how many people before someone figured out the pattern. How many had tried to help the sounds in the tree line or glanced directly at the merry-go-round or pulled open the door at 3 a.m. How many had tried to help Jamie find his parents instead of calling the cops? Walter's words echoed in my head. Enough. The late-season morning was getting brighter. Normal people starting their normal days, going to normal jobs where the biggest danger was a paper cut or spilled coffee. Meanwhile, I was sitting here trying to process the fact that I survived a that could have killed me in at least 5 different ways. The worst part was knowing I had to go back. I still had $43 to my name. The shift paid better than anything else I could find, and Walter hadn't precisely been beating down doors to hire people. I pulled the instructions sheet out of my pocket and unfolded it, reading through the 5 numbered points again. They glanced so simple on paper, so straightforward. Don't do this. Call the police if this happens. But living through them was something else entirely. The sounds in the tree line had been terrifying enough, but the merry-go-round standing shape, each one had tested my willpower in a different way. And Jamie had been the worst of all, because he glanced so genuinely helpless until the moment he'd revealed what he was. How long could I keep this up? How many nights could I follow these instructions precisely before exhaustion or fear or simple human curiosity made me slip up? One mistake, one moment of weakness. One time I glanced when I shouldn't or pulled open a door I should keep shut. I folded the instructions sheet and put it back in my pocket, then got out of the vehicle and made my way toward my apartment building. The morning felt surreal after the I had. Like I was moving through someone else's life. Other tenants were leaving for work, checking their phones, complaining about traffic. Normal problems, normal fears. I climbed the stairs to my second-floor apartment and unlocked the door. The place glanced precisely the same as when I'd left it yesterday evening. Unmade bed, dishes in the sink, bills stacked on the kitchen counter. But I felt like a different person walking into it. 10 hours ago, I'd thought the worst thing that could happen to me was getting evicted. Now I knew there were much worse fates than being homeless. I took a seat on my couch and fixed my gaze at the wall, the instructions sheet still burning a hole in my pocket. Tomorrow, I'd have to do it all over again. And the after that until I either saved enough money to find something else or made the mistake that meant I wouldn't be coming home at all. The apartment was hushed except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. Normal sounds, safe sounds. I shut my eyes and tried to imagine going back to that operations office tomorrow, sitting at that workbench while things moved in the tree line and knocked on the panes and tried to lure me into breaking the instructions that kept me breathing. I wasn't sure I could do it, but I wasn't sure I had a choice. Really scary stories, every day. Subscribe, like if you like, turn on the bell so you don't miss new videos.